Okay, I think we're live again. This is our second.
All right.
Okay, I don't know if there's any viewers right now. Hopefully, there are some viewers. I can't really see anybody right now. Anybody who is in here can type in chat whenever they want, and then we'll know if you're here. So today we're going to start our second podcast session of our Youth2Talk. So I'm your pastor June, and I'm joined by our senior going into college, Alex. Alex, if you can wave and say hello.
Good afternoon.
So, like the podcast before, this podcast is in this podcast we'll be discussing different subjects and trying to link and connect it to our Christian beliefs, our own Christianity. And we're trying to find where these subjects and topics and our Christianity should intersect. And so today, the topic that we'll be discussing will be about video games. Now, before we talk about video games, Alex, you and I both know that we both like video games a lot. We play video games together. We used to play video games at church. Tell me something about video games that you relate to and what you think video games are like. Just generally what video games are to you.
All right. Sounds good. Yeah. So everyone knows that I, especially at church, have a history of playing video games. To me, everyone knows video games is just another form of entertainment, but to me, I especially am very fond of it because it was something I grew up with when I was young. Starting with, first thing I played was with a Game Boy. To me, video games just brought a completely new aspect to life. It brought fantasies that I never really thought before was possible to my childhood. Whether it be something like simple as Mario Brothers or something as right now League of Legends, video games like continuously present to me new ideas and new fantasies. So, yeah.
And so yeah, for me, video games was very it was a very sparse childhood for me because my parents wouldn't let me play video games. So I did have a console, but I was very limited to how long I could play and what I could play. So the only games when I was young that I played was on the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo 64, and it was mostly Mario Kart, and then Super Mario 64, and also Donkey Kong and stuff like that. It wasn't a wide variety, and also they didn't let me play games that often. I had the consoles for a little bit in my childhood, but I didn't have them after that for a while. And they were very, they didn't want me to play video games as much. So every time I go to my friend's house or anywhere else, that's where I would have my video game fix, to be honest. And so with video games, let me just explain a little bit about video games. So video games are a form of art and entertainment. Video games require graphic designers and developers and all these kind of people to work together to create a video game. And a video game as a thing, as a noun, is a form of entertainment where people can come in, participate within the video game, and with the purpose of it being entertaining and it bringing fun to our lives. Now there may be lots of other purposes and reasons people play video games, and we'll get into that a little bit later on in the discussion. But for video games, it's a very tricky topic, especially for modern day Christianity, because there's a lot of different, opinions about video games. Some people think video games are anathema Other people think, oh, video games are fine. There's a lot of different opinions. And the reason why there are a lot of different opinions is because video games, if you look within the Bible, you will not find a verse or a paragraph or a chapter about playing video games, because video games did not exist back then. And so because it doesn't the term and the subject, the topic of video games doesn't exist in the Bible, what we have to do is we have to look at the principles of Scripture, the truths that Scripture tells us, and we make through gathering all those truths the most competent answer we possibly can to this subject of video games. Now, video games itself is it's also a very opinionated concept for most Christians. I think some people, oh, it's a sin. Other people, oh, it's okay. It's a lot of different things. So, Alex, what are your kind of thoughts, your kind of perspective on the matter of video games and Christianity?
Right. So, much like you know, growing up with video games has definitely been a big part of my life. You know, similar to you though, my parents weren't avid, keen promoters of this throughout my life, warning me that they will become too addictive and that they'll distract me from all the other stuff I should be doing in my life. That's kind of the same lines with the problem with video games within the sites of Christianity as well. Many people believe that Christians believe that video games is a waste of time, it's unproductive, and can also lead from other thoughts that stray away from biblical teachings. However, in my personal opinion, while that video games may pose those types of problems, correctly used, it should not be a problem or regarded as a sin, in my opinion. Much like other forms of entertainment, it is entertainment. It's another form of media use that many people use for relaxation and for comfort, which is not a sin at all.
And I'm pretty sure that our view and perspective on this topic does align a fair bit. Because you see, the kind of essence, the kind of just the statement of fact, the most important thing to note is the fact that just because people sin with something or in a particular thing does not make it innately sinful. And just because somebody can sin with something doesn't mean that we should bar other people from doing this thing. Just because you struggle with it does not mean you can then tell other people to not do it. You see? And that's the thing about, I think that is what kind of is the problem that video games have for most Christians. That most Christians see struggles with video games, or they themselves struggle with video games or something like that. And so they go to this extreme of, hey, okay, video games make you struggle, therefore it's bad, so don't do it. You can't do it as a Christian, you can't. And that kind of becomes like the solution that they give. But the fact is, it's not all that simple, and that is actually a very wrong perspective. It's a very arrogant, ignorant perspective, because it doesn't take into consideration all the principles of Scripture and the Bible and the truth that's in there, and it looks towards kind of like the full subject of what video games is. And this is what we're going to kind of do today. So first I'm going to talk about, first we need to assess the fact that there are different kinds of video games. Video games as a whole is just a very wide genre. In video games, there's lots of different kinds of video games. There's video games that you play by yourself. There's video games that you play with other people. There's video games, just like movies. There are horror video games. There are action video games. There's adventure video games. There's all these different kind of video games. And so when we also discuss video games, we can't just widely just generalize all video games as one lump sum subject. It is a very wide variety and array of different kinds of video games that we have to take into account when we're discussing this topic. So with that, why don't we go into kind of our discussion aspect? So I've looked at all these different articles, all these different YouTube videos to kind of figure out what people and especially Christians are saying about video games and what the common problems or the statements that they say against video games are. There were three very common objections that people had or they have about video games, and one of the biggest objections that I see are the fact that people question whether playing video games is the best use of time. So with that, Alex, kind of elaborate on this. What do you think about this premise that people bring up? The fact that video games are quote unquote a waste of time and that we shouldn't as Christians play video games.
Right. So I definitely agree with you, Pastor June, that when looking online and just like the common perception of video games, not even for Christians, but just for in the general perception of video games, one of the main problems against many people have against it is that it's considered a waste of time, that you could be doing anything else, exercising, doing whatever. So to talk about this, I kind of want to raise a example, another realistic example. Say that you, instead of playing a video game or you're not reading the Bible, you're instead reading a book instead. It's nothing to do with Christianity, no mention of religion at all. However, reading this book, it is also like intellectually stimulating your brain. It has good themes about life and promotes other characterization as well that has similar themes to what you might see in real life. You might find that in a lot of books, such as classic books, Brave New World, for example. Now, going back to video games, in my opinion, I think video games do something similar. True, there's many video games that might be seen as mindless or violent, but like Pastor June said earlier, that's only one subset, one genre of a video game. There are so many other video games that tell a clear story, clear and cohesive story, just like many books, many classical books for at that. So regarding the waste of time, I don't think so at all. Many video games that I play, in my experience, I found to be intellectually stimulating and edifying as well, bringing up points of philosophies from real life as well as a point of interest, and making that game expand on that and making the whole story expound on it. So not only is it just a great comfort, video games tell a story similar to what books do. So I do not think at all it's a waste of time at all.
Yeah, and as you said, you talked about how video games also have narrative at times, especially single-player video games have narrative at times. And like art also, it's a very philosophical work. You cannot video games also, more than most, have philosophy behind it, have meaning and purpose behind it. Whether that purpose would be kind of innately a little bit more on the vain side, or it actually is telling a meaningful story. There are a lot of different kinds of video games, like we said before. So when I look at this and I see people talk about, hey, it's a waste of time, you could use your time for other things and stuff like that, what I immediately think about is productivity. So this is a word that people use often in today's society as well. Everybody wants to be productive. And the fact that people are calling one thing a waste of time, another thing a better use of time, it's all about this concept of productivity, how you can be productive in your life. But what I want to talk about is the fact that, calling things a waste of time, calling things a better use of time, is this concept of productivity, and the fact that we have to understand what the purpose of productivity is, and what the standard of productivity is. Because why do we want to be productive in our lives? I mean, what do we want to be productive about? These are the things that are more important than the fact that oh, this one is a waste of time. This is not trying to see what is a waste and what is not. Rather, asking what is the standard of productivity? What is the purpose of productivity? And this may be a little bit confusing. Let me reiterate it or kind of explain it a little bit further. It's the fact that when somebody says one thing is a waste of time, they're not making a truth claim, they're making an opinion claim. You see?
Right.
It's not, they're not saying a truth claim. The fact that something is yellow or this chair exists that I'm sitting on, it's the fact that they think something is a waste of time. It's not a truth claim, it's an opinion claim. But it's an opinion claim that they're claiming arrogantly, ignorantly as fact. And this is what we need to figure out, because the concept of productivity is not a general truth standardized, like everyone needs to be productive in this way, this is true for the entire universe type of thing. Productivity is a very socially constructed concept, you know? How are you productive in this way or that way? Okay, if you need to live productively in society, you have to be an active member and a member that produces good things for society. You have to be an active member of school and a productive member of school by getting good grades and having good friends or something. You see, productivity is very subjective rather than objective. And it differs from different societies. It differs from different individuals. Productivity is it's a opinionated claim of what you think is a waste of time and what you think is not a waste of time. And you see, when people push their opinions upon you, that's different from pushing truth. Truth should be acknowledged and should be revealed. Opinions can just remain opinions, and you pushing opinions on other people will do nothing. It is simply meaningless to push objective opinions. And the fact that people are saying, hey, this is not a good use of time, it's a waste of time, this is a better use of time, they're just stating opinions, not facts. You see? And all these opinions are created by society, basically. Groups of people thinking in unison and saying, oh, this is truth. So it's society creating truth rather than society not creating, but revealing and discovering truth, you see?
Right.
And so I think this mostly comes from the fact that, even in China, they kind of limit youth game times, like people who are teenagers underage. They put a limit on how long they can play games. The government does, because they don't want kids to play games. They would rather them study or work and stuff so that it can benefit the people and the government. You see, that's what I'm saying about society creating standards, and productivity is definitely a societal concept that is enforced upon us either by people around us or by the reigning government or stuff like that. And it's what we need to understand is this is not a truth claim, this is an opinion claim, and it really holds no ground in terms of truth and reality. It's just peer pressure, basically. Do you kind of understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. So I want to talk a little bit about that example you used, bringing up Chinese censorship in video games, limiting the amount of time that certain kids or even young adults can play video games, if at all. So similarly to the United States, actually, many politicians and even the president himself believes that one of the main issues of society right now for America is violence, especially gun violence. So in their opinion, many politicians believe that video games is the source of gun violence among many of the young adults. So drawing similarities, I definitely see society creating this standard like video games. For example, this sort of medium is not productive and is actually counterproductive.
And I think you bring up a good point. And as we move on to the next question, next premise that most people talk about is the fact that video games creates violence or aggression in people and individuals. And there's been lots of people claiming this as well in articles and YouTube videos, not in like scientific ones, mind you, like psychological articles and stuff like that. More just kind of like just Christian articles or like just general, that kind of not really science based, not really kind of experimental based, just kind of like out there just claims. And the fact that video games causes violence or causes gun violence, causes aggressive behaviors, and this kind of thing is kind of just widespread, kind of like this misinformation. The fact that video games causes violence. But you talked a little bit about that, but what do you think this comes from, and what do you think about this? Is it true? Is it right?
So speaking of gun violence and its relation to video games, I definitely understand why a majority of the public do seem to think about this, like where they got this misconception from. An easy Google search will show you that many popular games include first-person shooters, a type of genre game which involves, as the name suggests, you personally shooting whatever the objective of the game is, whether it be zombies for Call of Duty or other people. Now, for Christians especially, many people draw the line at that point, saying video games cause violence because many of these types of games, especially in these modern times, have become more and more realistic. While many people seem to bring up the argument that, oh, this is just a video game, it's not real, many prominent Christian figures, at least in public, seem to think that as they get more realistic, they more accurately represent what they are in reality. However, the problem with this, saying that video games is the cause of violence, is that I believe it's just short-sighted in its entirety. I do believe that video games is a result of demographic and of culture, what the people want to see. And I think we need to analyze other stuff besides video games, which includes TVs, movies, and even music. A lot of these things outside of video games also promote similar things, yet no one really talks about it and just focuses video games because it focuses the young adult demographic the most. However, in my opinion, like I said before earlier, other forms of media bring up similar topics. Just as that is true, a lot of them also diverge away from that. And the same is true for video games as well. Not all video games are violent in its entirety. And even in video games that are violent, there is no correlation between violence and video games at all. Looking at a few, you mentioned research papers, how this is mentioned. This is basically purely on what Christians believe. But there's actually scientific proof as well that saying that recently in a 2019 paper that there is no correlation between violence and video games.
Yeah, so I looked at a lot of psychological articles as well, and most of them just claimed, okay, it's inconclusive. We don't know if video games cause violence or not. We can't prove that it does, but people would rather tend to believe that. I think it's a sort of like, it's a modern video games becomes kind of like a modern day scapegoat at times. Right. Like government, when people are being violent, tend to blame video games. As we see in America, that's what happens actually. News articles of governors and senators blaming video games, violence on video games. It's actually fairly common, and it's actually laughable how they do it. And like parents who blame their children's kind of like problems and stuff on video games. I mean, it's never them that's the problem. It's always something else. And video games seems to be kind of like the common scapegoat today. Governments blaming video games, parents blaming video games. It's a sort of, it's very common these days. And it's the fact that they don't want to deal with the issue. They don't want to acknowledge that they are part of what the problem is. They would rather just put it on something else. And video games tends to be that. Now, I'm not going to say that video games does not cause violence, because that's also inconclusive. We don't know if it does or if it doesn't. It's just studies have been inconclusive. So it could or it could not. There is no conclusive study on that. But I think it's more the fact it's not video games cause violence. It's more violence is the origin of what our the violence within our world today, the violence within our reality today is what causes video games to have an embodiment of that within their kind of content. It's because violence exists and it's real and it's kind of widespread around the world and people experience it is why video games have that concept within them. It's not video games causing violence, it's violence already within the world being embodied in video games. You see?
Right.
It's not that direction of video games violence within video games causing violence in real life. It's real life violence creating violence within video games. I think that is more a better correlation of events than the other way around, because the other way around doesn't actually make sense, because video games especially were not available throughout, like, up until this present age, they were very unavailable. And even these kind of violent video games were very unavailable. But violence happened continually throughout history. You see? So I don't think you can claim that video games cause violence to an extent that it is the soul and origin and kind of like the main source of violence that happens within our world and our community. It's not. It's more the fact that the violence that's already in the world, that's already happening, that stems from people's selfishnesses, people's greed, people's tendency for violence. That's just embodied in the video games that people develop and sell.
Right, I have to agree with that sentiment. Like as I said before, like video games aren't the only scene of violence for like young adults either. Like especially in these days, a lot of modern movies and music also typically revolve around violence, and I really do think that's a result of not only people's tendencies but also the current pop culture.
Yeah. And yeah, there's violence. Just putting violence on video games is definitely just a very generalized statement. There's definitely a lot of other things that influence violence for sure. And one other thing that I wanted to also talk about is the fact that video games are a very consumer oriented system. It's not like you create you create a supply and a demand comes in. Video games tend to not work like that. There are innovations where you make a new type of video game and a demand is created, but for the most case, there is already a demand and just the developers and the gaming companies supply for that demand. And in cases of this, there are demands for violent video games. People are violent with or without video games. Video games do not cause violence. I think this is more a reality than people would rather not accept this and rather just use video games as a scapegoat, as an escape to their actual problems rather than to deal with it themselves. This is what it comes down to. Also, for anybody who's watching right now, I don't know if we have anybody watching, but if you would like to comment and or give us any questions that you want us to discuss, we will look through it. We will comment on your comments and we will answer and discuss any of your questions as much as we possibly can. So feel free to comment and put up questions, and we will try to look at them and discuss them as we have time. So as we talk more about violence in video games and just the different kind of premises that people make against video games, the third and kind of like the most prevalent one is the fact that gaming causes addiction. So video games causes addiction. Now, what do you think about this kind of argument that people bring up?
Now, this is an interesting, especially an interesting point because as someone who does play video games, I have been accused of this addiction myself. Um, in more of a scientific setting, interesting enough, I believe it was around 2018, the World Health Organization actually classified video game addiction as an plausible and real addiction. Now, besides that point, personally, I have to say this. As someone who does play games, I do see a reality of video game addiction. However, just like all social media, all forms of media, anything, even things like reading or something as constructive as exercising can be a form of addiction.
Yeah, and
So,
addiction takes different levels for sure. There is levels of addiction, definitely. People can be very addicted to something and very mildly addicted to something. And so, with that, I am going to say that yes, games do, in fact, cause addiction at times. But this isn't the problem with video game, it's a problem with the person, you see. The video game does not cause like it doesn't decide to cause addiction. It's the person who decides to be addicted to this. It's not like this chemical dependence that people have, like nicotine or caffeine gives in terms of addiction. It's more people decide to prioritize and be addicted to this kind of thing. You see, I mean, we can talk about like just kind of like the workings of the brain and how neurons and the what's it called, the happy things, endorphins work. Yeah,
dopamine?
yeah, dopamine and endorphins work. Yeah. So, we can talk about that as well, but it's more the fact that in the case of video games, it's not video games itself that's addicting. It's people that choose to be addicted or that decide or that make way and give the control over to video games. And video game addiction is actually definitely something that we should be aware of because people are more or less have this mild to extreme ranges of video game addiction. And even in the youth, I could probably see various people that are addicted to in one way or another to video games. I myself, I feel like have been addicted to video games in certain degrees. And it's not a matter of like, this kind of like nicotine addiction where when you get like shakes and stuff and you need it and you might go through withdrawal, I'm not sure. But you see, for video games itself, it's how much you prioritize this, and it's more or less about kind of like your selfishness and self-centeredness, to be sure, because you're letting your desire for video games, to satisfy your desire for the video games, to overcome some of the other aspects of your life, some of the other responsibilities of your life that you have. And see, it's a kind of, I want to satisfy my desire rather than I need to live this way a little bit and give up some of these desires, you see. And that's where selfishness and self-centeredness takes place in terms of addiction and in terms of video game addiction, for sure. Because nobody goes like, oh, I have to play video games or I'll die, or I have to play video games or I'll go through like nicotine withdrawal or something. It's just, I want to play video games. I feel like I'm gonna die. But you see, nobody's gonna not play video games and die because they didn't play video games.
Right. So I just kind of want to expand on what you said. Like you said earlier before, it's different from what you would, such as the physical abuse of addiction, such as drugs or maybe even alcohol, where overconsumption affects the bodily chemicals within you and it actually changes how you perceive things mentally. While video games, it's not really so much physically a chemical change. It's more of a maybe a person, like you said before, a personal choice to continue to play video games over responsibility. And I think that's where a lot of people draw a lot of people, when in response to hearing about video addiction, that's where the line gets drawn. Many people don't see video addiction as a real thing. However, it is a real thing in the fact that it does pose a threat to those who prioritize gaming over real life responsibilities. And that is somewhat related to Christ as well, where Christians believe that video games, they distract you from God. And at the same time, as before, while that may be also true, it is a person's choice where to distract themselves. For me personally, video games just pose as my favorite hobby. In church, many people see me with my Nintendo Switch. I do play video games a lot. I admit that. It is my favorite hobby. However, I am not, like you said before, life dependent, or nor do I avoid my responsibilities towards school or towards church at all. It is something I merely enjoy.
Yeah, and for addiction, like I said before, there are many different levels. So what we do actually have to do is acknowledge these kind of different levels of addiction and how much of an addiction I may or may not have. I know people would rather not consider themselves addicts, but for me, what I think is we're all addicts to things in some sort of way. And definitely we are addicted. Some people may show extreme levels of addiction to one thing. Other people may show mild levels of addiction to many different things. But for myself and my opinion on what I think about addiction, I think everybody has an addiction in some sense to whatever thing that they may be addicted to, and however levels of addiction that may occur within their lives. But I think in terms of Christianity, it's a understanding that sometimes we have to give up levels. I mean, our addictions for God and be addicted to God. You see, the levels of addiction that we have to certain things is, when we examine it, we need to acknowledge it, and when we acknowledge it, we need to seek where we should then place our priority, our addiction, so to speak. And for Christians, that is in fact God. And that's another thing that I wanted to talk about, which is priority. I always talk about how we need to live a holistic life. We need to live a Christian life. And a Christian life does not mean coming to church, reading the Bible, and praying every day. Being a Christian means studying for God. Being a Christian means eating for God. Being a Christian means living your entire life, the entirety of your life, all the aspects and the compartments you have in your life for God. And what I want to ask is, how can we then game for God? Can we even game for God?
Regarding on gaining for God, I really do think it is possible. I mean, like you said before, Christianity isn't just merely the physical actions of going to church or reading the Bible. It's the fact that whatever you do every day, your physical actions every day, whether or not you're at church or not, are you doing it for God? And I think through that is how you feel yourself with God. With video games, like I said before, it is a problem because can be addictive in the fact that you might distract yourself from God.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So I think what do you think? So what is your answer for how can we glorify God in gaming, or how can we game to glorify God?
I think I feel like, disregarding what type of game you're playing, I feel like if you go into the fact you're playing a game, and if it's some way insightful, edifying in any way, mentally or intellectually, if it's you're going into it with this aim of relaxation and trying to enjoy the moment, I think you can go into video games with that idea of enjoying yourself and relaxing for God. I really do think it's possible with that mindset. Instead of focusing on what the physical action is during the video game, but rather you're doing this for a sense of relaxation. If you take a step back from what the video game is and more of the personal relaxation, I do feel like you can aim towards God in that manner.
Yeah, and I am kind of completely with you on that fact. The fact that Yeah, we can enjoy games for God. It's a game. God created men, men created games. Men created games to be enjoyed with a specific purpose and narrative sometimes. And we can enjoy games for God. We can also fellowship with games in God as well, just like we do in the youth when we play Smash Bros. Sometimes our fellowship is not very edifying, with people sometimes getting mad at each other, people
Right.
sometimes not saying the best of words to each other when playing. But it's the fact that despite the sinners we are, and despite not being able to fellowship well, the fact that we can fellowship in video games, we can glorify God with fellowship, with our fellowship together within video games. And not only that, one crucial thing that I think we can do to glorify God in gaming is to be able to control our intake. You see, there's things we do to glorify God, and there's things we don't do to glorify God as well. And for gaming, one thing you can do is try to control your intake. Try not to prioritize games over God, or as much as you do, in a way that's debilitating, not only in your just societal life, but in your life with Christ. You see, controlling your intake, self-control, is a very God glorifying thing, because if we didn't practice self-control, we would definitely not glorify God very well within our lives. And for gaming, one crucial thing that I think we could glorify God in is in this aspect of self-control. We need to. I'm not saying that gaming is bad. No, I'm definitely not saying that for sure. I'm not saying gaming is bad. Yes, I'm saying that one way to glorify God in our gaming is to control our intake, is to make sure that though we enjoy games, we're not prioritizing it over God. You see, and this is where we in fellowship as well, we're not prioritizing gaming over fellowship like some people actually do when we do fellowship with games in the youth. We're not supposed to prioritize gaming over fellowship. The gaming is for fellowship, so we're supposed to prioritize fellowship and gaming. Just like when I do youth retreat activities and all the recreation stuff, well, I'm not doing the recreation so that you can prioritize the recreation over fellowship. I'm doing it so that you can fellowship in recreation, which some people do not get at times when we do our retreats.
I just want to add to that. Yeah, with the fact that even self-control, the limiting how much you play, is in fact an attempt to glorify God more. That is how you input. I really do. I never really thought of it that way, but that is one way to put God into video games. Bringing up that example, I also thought something more along like, when let's say more violent games, because we still have that person issue. I do think self-control within those games as well, whether you're speaking to other people or maybe even like maybe bad game behavior such as cursing, which is somewhat correlated. I do believe self-control in that aspect, what you do during those games, is also an attempt at bringing God into games as well. Trying not to curse, for instance, or trying to be not to be overreactive.
Yeah, and definitely when you're playing a game with other people, that's definitely another way to glorify God for sure. Because when you play games with other people, it tends to be more competitive games, and in competitive games, you tend to be less God glorifying at times. And that is also another way to glorify God. The fact that when we're playing games, our behavior and our attitude, not only within the game but towards the people who we are playing online with, is actually God glorifying as well. So that is definitely another. Also, and as you said, there are different kinds of games. Also, another way to glorify God is to restrain yourself from playing certain games that are definitely, the content is not very good. You see?
Right.
Because there are
So I
games
do.
with the content is definitely not a good content. And now I play first person shooters. I play first person shooters a lot. I like the genre of first person shooter. It's not, I guess, the best genre, but I don't think that it's the worst genre for sure. And and definitely there can be arguments made for and against first person shooters. In my personal opinion, I think first person shooters are all right. But when we get into very different genres containing sexually explicit material, containing just like very, very violent things, like it's just something that we have to keep aware of. I mean, people have different, I guess, levels of tolerance for sure. This isn't a black and white kind of system where we say, oh, these games are definitely good, these games are definitely bad. There is a very wide array and different levels that people can tolerate for sure. Because some people look at an ounce of blood and they're completely just put off by it. For those people, that's definitely a different tolerance level and a different kind of standard that they have to set themselves with. And for individuals, it's all different for each person, and we need to figure out what are kind of like how we have to think about it for sure. And we can't just mindlessly intake all these different contents and say, oh, it's okay, it's just video games. We can't. We have to actually think about the contents within video games, certain video games, and see, okay, can I actually play this game and still glorify God? I think it's not that black and white as we perceive it to be. It's much more, we have to think about it for ourselves and figure it out for ourselves for sure. But there are contents that are specifically not very God glorifying, that are a major aspect of different kinds of games.
I think when you say these things aren't black and white, I do agree. So going back over to the topic of video, like first-person shooters, gun violence, and let's bring in sexualization as well. Those two things is already very deeply rooted within gaming as well already. Let's take Valorant for example. Valorant and Overwatch both are similar in genre, both first-person shooters, and you get to choose which character you play as. Some of them being females. Now, when you talk about over-sexualization, right? The fact that they have females in there, the demographic of video games are young adults. So, in my opinion, I do believe video game companies do try to target that audience with how they create female characters. That being said, those games, the objective and the overall view of the game isn't about those characters at all. It's about winning whatever objective the first-person shooter is. So I think the problem is when it comes to is that the sole objective of the game? Is it something that is the sole objective of the game something that is completely bad? And that's something people need to think about when playing and choosing a game to play.
Yeah, for sure. It's very it's you have to think about it. You can't be this passive kind of consumer. You have to be a very active and very kind of informed consumer for sure. And anything, and especially for video games, you have to be a very active consumer. You have to be a very informed consumer. You have to be a very thinking consumer, because you can't, if you just passively just intake all the things that people give you, you will be influenced by it, and some of them will be bad. Speaking about influence, we're also going to talk about this kind of influence that gaming has, because we talked about like, oh, violent video games create violence, or video games create addiction, and the fact is video games do influence us to a certain extent. I mean, and for some people, definitely for some people, it can blur the lines of reality. We look at like there's news about like 12-13-year-old boys that played Grand Theft Auto 5 or whatever version of Grand Theft Auto and decided to do a Grand Theft Auto for themselves. You know, just go out and take their parents' car out for a joyride. It happens. There's also the news about this Slenderman stabbing, where these girls played Slenderman, and they got kind of a little bit obsessed by trying to prove Slenderman's existence. And in the end, what happened was they these two girls, 12 years old, brought this other girl over into the forest and then stabbed her like 16 times in order to try to summon Slenderman and prove his existence. You see, for some people, definitely for some people, gaming has a greater influence on them than it may have on other people, and it may blur these lines of fiction and reality for them. And this is something that we have to watch out for, especially in terms of gaming influencing our thoughts and our perception of reality. Now, tell me a little bit about what you think about this.
So, yeah, these are definitely what I would consider extreme cases of video gaming. There is plenty more. For example, school shootings. Many people seem to draw that back for violent video games such as GTA as well. And of course, this isn't the normal person. This is the extreme case. I think for Christians, this goes back to what we said earlier about self-control being so important for Christians when playing video games, how to bring that God aspect into them. I think, especially in these, discerning what reality is just a true, apparent, and important fact for Christians to do. What is reality as Christians, not only when we live everyday life, but also when we do for leisure activities such as video gaming. So yeah, while I do see it is definitely a concerning problem, I think it is more along the lines of self-control, what is real, discerning what is real, and making that decision. This isn't real. This is a fictional game.
Yeah, and it's a fact that we have to be we have to understand that we are influenced by our environment. And what we consider an influence by our environment is a very passive influence. We don't think about it. It's not a conscious like intake of kind of influence. It's more of like this passive unconscious, because this environment, because of these exposures, we gain this kind of perception and thought pattern. And for anybody, any person, any individual, what we have to do is limit this passive intake of environmental influences and actually be active partakers and thinking about what things we actually believe and hold to. You see, because, and especially these blurred lines of reality are most cases younger kids, and probably these younger kids, when education is not done right, they don't these lines of reality and fiction are definitely blurred when they're spending more time in games and they're not understanding what's real and what's fake, what is actually reality, this external world around us, and what it's actually just a fictional representation of reality that people have developed and made up in gaming companies and developing companies. It's these people that aren't educated. These kids that aren't educated enough, aren't learned enough in terms of discerning what is right, what is true, opposed to what is wrong and what is fake. These kids are more prone to influence, especially, and we're talking about video games, but it's in terms of entire industry of entertainment, and not only that, but mass media and society as well. So it's not it's this passive intake of a kind of thought and perception of reality that we need to kind of not do, and have a more active understanding of what we're actually thinking and what these environments and these things around us are actually telling us to believe, and versus what is actually true.
Right. So, with that in mind, being actively aware of what we choose to believe rather than passively just accepting it from whatever media, I think as we get older, as people get older, they develop a better understanding of what is real naturally. But regarding how young people are the most to experience misunderstanding of taking whatever video games they're playing and applying it to the real world, I think that there's not it's not so much an issue of video games rather than an issue of what content they're intaking in general and what's allowing them to do so. So in that case, I think maybe even instead of like targeting video games saying this is a cause, I'd say that instead of that, we need to enforce better, better all just judgment of what games they play, whether by parents or just by observing them more. I feel like for younger people, that is important. And as they get older, they'll be able to make that decision on their own.
And also, you talked about as they get older. I do not like this statement for sure, just because of the fact that that's also kind of like environmentally passive
Right.
based understanding of reality. Because as you get older just means as time passes and as you get exposed more passively to the surroundings around you, you learn about reality. But that's not the case. It's not as you get older, as time passes, and as you get exposed to more of your environment, is as you actually actively think and as you actively try to understand reality, that you actually understand reality, you see? Because you have some 30, 40-year-old people that still don't understand what reality is. They're still kind of brainwashed by social environment and by whatever kind of surroundings that they have around them. They've never actively thought for themselves, hey, what is reality? Why do I believe this is reality? And things like that. So this is going off on a little tangent, but this is kind of the normative thinking that people have. As I get older, I will learn more. I will be smarter. I will be more able to think and do these things. But that's actually not the case. It's not it's not in terms of time and in terms of being more exposed to to your surroundings. It's actually thinking for yourself and thinking more deeply and examining your own life and the world around you in order to gain a better grasp and understanding of what truth is, what actually exists and what does not, what is actually true and what is not.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree with you and say that. It was a bad example to use older as something, the phrase I said earlier, being as you get older, you become better. I think that was poor word choice on my part because, as you just said, there are definitely older age individuals who have no conception of reality. So, yeah, I think it is, like you said, an issue of thinking for your own.
It's not really. I mean, I wouldn't call it a portraits of words. It's just more or less what people believe or think these days in society. Anyways, the fact that when you're young, you're kind of disregarded as like, oh, you're not old enough, and when you're older, you're like, oh, now you understand more type of thing because you've lived a few more years or something like that. But that's I don't know. I would state that that's not actually there's not a correlation between more years lived and just better understanding of reality. There really is not. It's just more time for you to get kind of like brainwashed with the environment, just this passive understanding seeping in because of the surrounding exposure that you have. And that's just what it is. It's not a better understanding of reality. Time doesn't create a better understanding of reality. Time just creates more time for you to be exposed to your environment and gain this passive knowledge rather than active knowledge. And for today, what this environment and this passive understanding comes from is not only from games, but from music, from TikTok, from YouTube videos, from friends at school. It's all of this that creates this. And so I think we do need to break this understanding that it's not of time being the main factor for better understanding and being able to gain more knowledge. It definitely isn't. It's just more time to be brainwashed into society. It's definitely just more time just to intake environment and just go with environment rather than think for yourself. And I don't know. I am very strongly opinionated and in this thing because it goes. This is the things that I'm trying to break. This is the kind of just the standard of education that I want to break the mold of. This isn't real education. This is what we just call brainwashing. into society, adaptation into society, rather than actually seeking, learning, and living out truth. They're two different things for sure. But yes, kind of moving on from that topic, that was just a little bit of tangent I just wanted to take just because I am interested in that kind of thing. Also, for those of you who are in here and watching this, if you want to, you can type in chat, ask questions, and we will try to answer you as best you can. I think we do have one. It's not coming up on my screen, but I do have one. I have my phone on, and it looks like Paul has been chatting with us. I did not know this up until this point, but Paul asks a question. Let me read it to you, Alex. It says, what are your thoughts about this generation where kids would rather stay inside and play games rather than go outside and be active? Alex, what do you think about this?
Hearing that question, it feels like this is a personal attack against me, so I guess I should answer this. I am one of those kids in that generation. I can tell you that for sure. So my problem, my take on this is that I always enjoyed video game as my most favorite hobby. So I guess that would lead me being more indoors oriented than outdoors oriented. But in my opinion, I do get where some people have an issue with that. People spend too much time indoors rather than doing something outdoors, such as exercising or just hanging out with other people, forming social relationships. I just think this is kind of goes back to what Pastor June and I kind of discussed earlier with self-control and time management. If you spend so much time indoors that is the only thing you live, like your whole entirety of your life is just solely based on how you live indoors playing video games, rather than occasionally going outside, exercising, seeing friends, even the usual stuff, spending time outside hours after school. You just purely live for going back indoors and playing video games. I think that does pose a problem. And as for our generation, I'm sure there will be some sort of effects or some sort of trend you might see with that generation. However, I do believe that's what I want to stress. And at least in my life, I try to strive for at least some sort of balance. While video games is my hobby, I do have an obligation, not even an obligation. I personally see it's good. I personally myself see it's good to go outside occasionally to exercise, to partake in whatever activities I do at school. For a more personal example, at least in middle school through high school, I stay many hours after school for marching band. And that for me has been, I'd say, a good balance of spending multiple hours with a bunch of my friends practicing my instrument, which is both instructive physically, and it can also be intellectually pleasing as well. While at home, I would spend my free time playing video games. So I think that there should be a balance, and I agree about the problem of a generation of kids staying indoors too much over a mixture might pose a problem. So yeah.
And for me, I don't think this actually has to do with gaming at all. The fact that indoor and outdoor thing, it's more of like an old wives' tale, I think. The fact that your mom or dad says, "Oh, go outside and play; it's good for you," type of thing. It doesn't. I don't think it has anything to do with gaming. Just the fact that people think being outdoors is better than being indoors, and definitely. Being outdoors is a good thing, but it's kind of like, okay, what if you live somewhere in Sweden where the next house over is a mile away and it's snowing, blizzarding, and stuff like that? It's like being outdoors is not that good as being indoors, you know?
Right.
It's more this social kind of concept, this kind of old generation kind of concept of because when throughout history indoors wasn't as, let's say, evolved as it is today, when there was no TV, no PC, no console, no gaming, no internet. What people had to do was go outside and play. Home was just a place to eat and a place to sleep. They would go out to play, out to work in the fields and stuff like that. it would just be, that's just what happened because there was nothing to do at home. Now you can definitely, going outside is healthy for you as well, you know, getting some of that vitamin D with the sunshine, and just having a little bit of exercise, you know. The correlation between people staying indoors and obesity is also something that we that needs to be, you know, to be acknowledged. But in terms of just gaming, it's not like gaming is creating people to creating this kind of indoorsy environment, though it is kind of a factor in it. It's more the case that indoors is right now so much better. And also the fact that it's not really like when I was young, we could like go to the neighborhood park and stuff like that and play. Uh, and and in America during that time, it was much less kind of like people were much less concerned about, you know, like gun violence and people like trying to kidnap your kid and stuff. But these days, it's especially, well, in which environment and which neighborhood you live for sure. But in some neighborhoods, in some places, it's definitely staying indoors is much safer than going outdoors for sure, especially unsupervised. It's just not a safe possibility in some cases. So I think this question is a very circumstantial question to ask, because if I did live in a really bad neighborhood, I would rather not have my kids play outside if possible, just because it might not be as safe, especially if I live somewhere in like Baltimore where like gun violence is like the highest and crime rates are highest. I would rather not have my kids run out without supervision. So it's more in terms of it's a very circumstantial question for sure, and much less to do about gaming. I think, in my personal opinion, but that's just me. So yeah. So Alex, I know that you had some questions as well. So just choose a question and we'll discuss it.
All right, so we kind of already talked about this, but I just wanted to, on your opinion, just to refresh. Since you're a pastor, you have a wife and family now, but as someone who still enjoys playing video games, how do you like? How does that balance look like from between your work, your family life, and from your own personal enjoyment of video games? How does that look like to you?
So this also is a little bit less about video games because it's more to do with like priorities and marriage for sure. So I would save a more detailed explanation for later if we get into like topics such as marriage and dating and stuff like that.
Right.
But it's just the fact that you have, as you progressively, I guess, mature, or I'm not going to say you get older because people get older but do not mature at times. So as you let's mature,
right,
whenever you do mature and if you do mature, the fact that maturity comes with different priorities and different responsibilities that you will have to juggle in your life, and especially when you get in terms of marriage that and like kids, that's even that's a greater amount of responsibility and priorities that you have to juggle. And it's just a fact of sacrifice. You do have to sacrifice a whole lot in order to prioritize all these other things in your life that need to be prioritized. And that's the reason I don't stay up late playing games as much as I want to. That's why I don't play games like 7 days of the week. I can barely play games like once or twice a week, if that. So yeah, so it's not a way of it's not just like just gaming in terms of giving. It's not a gaming question per se. It's just more
like
of
a general question.
Yeah, just a general question, a general kind of answer of as you mature and as you throughout your life gain or obtain more responsibilities, and especially as you grow as a Christian and you gain more responsibilities as a Christian as well, there are things that you will have to let go, not just video games, but your hobbies, your desires, your dreams, what have you. There are things that you will have to sacrifice and let go in order to accommodate these other priorities and responsibilities that are of greater importance than these other things, and it's just the case. And that's my life so far. In what I see, I used to play games like probably almost daily when I was younger, but now that's like if once a week. Yeah, but yeah, it's just a case for life, I think.
Right.
It's yeah.
I think, as I'm about to prepare and leave for college, I think I'm gonna, and like in like foresight, I guess. I think I'll probably experience similar things as well, where I have to not comparing it college life to marriage, of course, where each has its own struggles. Where college is academic, while marriage is family life. You have your own family obligations to take care of. Not comparing those two, but rather there's things that you have to prioritize over your own enjoyment in both. I feel like so. I feel like I will, you know, I will experience somewhat a similarity to what you're saying right now, where you have to sacrifice some days of gaming or just entirely games to accommodate other stuff.
And I
So,
feel like for most people currently as well, there are things that they should do to kind of lessen their gaming time and put some more things in for sure. But they're not doing it because they're prioritizing gaming above all these other things when they should not as well. Not only as they mature, but right now, if your life is filled much more with gaming than other responsibilities that you have, including God, then you are definitely not doing it right. So I think when I said as you mature, you gain more responsibilities, it's almost cyclical. You prioritize the things you should prioritize, and in that way you mature, and that way you gain more responsibilities,
right.
and in that way you mature more as you are able to control yourself and prioritize the right things in your life. So it continues like that, I think. So it's not just a matter of after you mature or before you mature, is as you mature you do this, as you do that, and it just one builds upon the another, and it's just a cyclical thing. Yeah. So Alex, I know that you had a few other questions. There was one that I wanted to talk about, but I don't remember which one. So I just say any ask any other question, and we'll kind of discuss it.
So we kind of talked about your stance against common perceptions of video games, both as a person who has history with video games, and as a pastor. So I want to kind of ask a more laid back question. So many of the youth group and just people in general know that both of us play League of Legends, which is classified as a MOBA. So for those of you who don't know, MOBAs are basically like a battle arena where you choose a character and you basically fight against the other teams in a simplified manner. So, as someone who also plays League, what makes these types of games so, in your opinion, so entertaining? Because I feel like that's one of the main games you play in your free time.
Can you ask the question again?
So, what makes League of Legends entertaining to you so much? So,
Oh,
that's my
like
question.
I don't stuff like League and Valorant and things like that. I
All
mean,
right.
it's a lot to do with, I don't know. When I focus more on like, first it's like, you have to control yourself in terms of like, kind of like, how you have to run and you have to do stuff in actual sports. Like you have to dribble the ball and stuff like that. There's a kind of skill to be learned, and there's a strategy that you have to incorporate. So in basketball, you have to learn how to dribble, how to pass, how to shoot, and then there's strategies. You have to learn strategies in terms of defense, in terms of offense, like how you rotate around the court and stuff like that.
Right.
In games, it's the same thing. In terms of sports, the skill cap is very strong, especially in sports. The fact that you can't become taller to become better at basketball. You can't, even if you try your best and exercise as much as you can, sometimes you just can't kind of overcome that skill cap of trying
Right.
to, become better at basketball. But in games, it's much more under your control because you have to just figure out how to move the mouse, how to press the buttons on your keyboard, and how to play the game a certain way strategically. And I feel like that, I think it gives me more sense of kind of like, oh, I've achieved of achievement because of the fact that there is a much higher skill cap. Like, it's not like my physical body that drags me down in terms of how I play the game. It's however much I can move this mouse and think about the game and how to play the game strategically as I before I play the game and as I play the game. And I think that kind of speaks to me more and why I'm interested in things like League of Legends, because it's you think about strategy, but you also think about how you have to play and what when you press these buttons and where
Right.
you move your mouse and stuff like that and how fast you do that. There is a skill cap in terms of like moving mouse and thinking really fast and your response time and stuff like that. But even then, it's much of a lower skill cap. There's you can just train a little bit more to be better at that kind of thing. Well, in basketball and soccer and that type of thing, the physical aspect is much more gatekeeping.
Right.
Some of these physical things you just can't overcome by practice. You just can't. And yeah, so that's why and also games are just more readily accessible. I can just sit down in front of my computer and play games. Well, soccer or basketball, there's a lot of finding people to play with, having a designated location to play with, and stuff like that. So it's just the ease of access and the kind of lower skill cap, so that so that no, the yeah, the lower skill cap, so that I can kind of do these things in games and practice these things to get better at games. While in terms of sports and physical sports and stuff like that, you can't in certain aspects. Yeah, that's also why I like first person shooters as well, because it's a lot of strategy of where you have to be. You have to continue to think about what other people are doing in the game, what you should be doing in the game. People don't think about games like that, especially people that don't understand games. But there's a great deal of strategy in games, in video games especially, and I like that aspect. I like being able to think about what I'm doing, think about the gaming, and have that achievement of when I win because I thought well or better than the other person and stuff like that. I don't know. Yeah, that's just my appeal to games. Also, another
No,
appeal
I
is you
completely
can
agree too.
yeah, you can play with other people that you normally could not play with, like basketball with try to find a whole bunch of other people, while online games you just get on, go in, and the
Right.
game just randomly picks a whole bunch of different people and you can just play with them. It's much easier.
Right.
Yeah, so that's why I think I have a more affinity for video games than other sports. I do like other sports, but it's just not as accessible. There's a greater skill cap, so you can't. You know that even if you practice a whole bunch, it's not. You can't overcome this physical aspect of the game. You're only gonna be as good as your physical body allows you to be, and stuff like that. And so yeah, those kind of things are what I like more about video games for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
may I ask one more quick
Yeah.
question
Yeah.
before we move on? So, everyone kind of has like, at least for like the older generation who kind of grew up with the upcoming of video games, a lot of those types of people have not a favorite game necessarily, but more of a nostalgia game. For many people, that might be very like the very first Halo game. It might be Final Fantasy VII. I just wanted to know, do you have like a kind of nostalgia game you kind of always reminisce as being this great game in your childhood, or not?
Actually, I
And what is
don't.
it?
I don't. I think if I did, it would be like the Legend of Zelda games and the Pokemon games. Those two games, I think, would be the most nostalgic kind of games for me. Because, when you're young and you're trying to play the Zelda games, the GBA games, and stuff like
Right.
that, it's just, you have to think a lot. And it's a lot of trial and error. You're like, where is this? Where am I? What am I supposed to do? And when you get into like these dungeons and you're like stuck in there for like weeks on end because you don't know where the next key is or where how to open this door, and stuff like that. It's just, yeah, those kind of games are more nostalgic for me because I had to figure out. I had to like they even Pokemon training these Pokemons. They take a
Right.
lot of time, and so while you're playing this for a long period of time, you gain this kind of like nostalgia towards it as you look back in your life. I think so. Those two games are kind of like what I think would be the more nostalgic games for me. Yeah, I can't think of anything else that I would consider. I think the Final Fantasy games, not Final Fantasy games, the Fire Emblem games would also be a part in that because you would have to level up characters as well, and
Right.
if they die, they're done, so you won't have them anymore, and that kind of thing would create that kind of like, oh, how I like this character, but this character died, and I have this character now. Maybe I'll try to grow this character, and then this character dies and stuff. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, those kind of games were yeah kind of like the nostalgic games for me. I think. Yeah. So with that today, I think we'll slowly go into our conclusion. But today we talked a little bit about video games with Alex. So these video games, as Christians, um, they're as a throughout like kind of this generational kind of church entering a weird holy religious phase where they're like, oh, anything that doesn't even have Jesus in it is a sinful thing and we shouldn't do it and stuff like that. As there was a sort of this religious holy phase where Christians would be overtly spiritual and try to like play music backwards and say, oh, this is like trying to summon Satan and stuff like that. We had these weird eras within the church where people did over spiritualize their lives and the different aspects of society. And today, I feel like with video games, we have to get rid of, I think we have to think through this weird unrealistic stigma and anathema that we have for video games. It's not a theological, biblical way of thinking. It's just a more ignorant and a just passive approach to understanding today's aspects of today's society. And that one aspect being today, video games. I think for Christians, video games should be something that is something that we can use to glorify God, and should be something we use to glorify God. Because if we just say video games are sinful, don't do it, we're losing a aspect of reality that we could glorify God in. Instead of saying, let's glorify God in this aspect, we say, oh, let's disregard this aspect of life, and then what we do is we don't bring God's glory, God's love, God's mercy and grace into this aspect of society and of life. We just let this go and let our responsibilities of bringing God's love and God's glory go in this aspect. And we shouldn't do that as Christians. We should explore each and every single aspect of reality that we live in today and try to glorify God and bring God's love into these different subjects, these different topics, these different aspects. And one of them is video games. And people just need to be less ignorant of this and understand the fact that we need to think about these things much more actively than just accepting this passive understanding that the church and former Christians had before us, and we say, oh, because they had it, we should have it as well. We need to really think things through and be able to understand that video games are not just things from the devil that we need to shun. It is actual aspects of our society today and of entertainment that today that we can use to glorify God in. And the aspect remains of how we should glorify God in this way. And this is how I want the youth students to look at how I want the youth students to look at these things within society, within culture, within our reality, and how I want them to kind of focus and expose their own understanding and kind of be able to examine themselves and how they believe the things that they believe, how they perceive things that they perceive, and how we turn all things to glorify God. How we, the place, the intersection where any subject meets our Christianity. I'm gonna refer to the intersection a lot because I like this word, the intersection of where video games meets Christianity. So yeah, that'll be it for today. Before we end, I did ask Alex for a special favor. So why I invited Alex in for today's Youth2Talk is because Alex is one of the graduates of our senior class leaving our youth and going into college. So with that, I wanted to ask Alex to just leave us with a few words that he wants to say in terms of his experience at church, his experience growing up into his belief of Christianity, and just the kind of wisdom or his testimony that he could leave us with, his final words, so to speak, so that to where we can learn and remember Alex by. So with that, Alex, if you would like to, you can. I'll give the mic to you.
All right, thank you, Pastor Dean. So I don't know who's watching this currently, but I just want to say thank you for everything. Many of you who know me in the youth group have been with me. A vast majority of the youth group currently have known me ever since I arrived at the church in 4th grade, and have been with me throughout, ever since then. Not even during church, but just throughout my life. And even those who have left the youth group, part of the EM, and new people who have left and new people that came, all of these people were part of my life, and I would say made a big part of what I perceived of myself as Christian. I really, for a vast majority of time, everyone at church at Hanbit really did help me shape who I am today. So I just want to thank everyone who I met along the way. Growing up as a Christian, we did the usual stuff together, going to Bible study together, reading, small Bible verses together. But as we grew up together, even those who I didn't really think I'd get to know as part of the youth group, through retreats, through just everyday seminars, and through fellowship, I really do believe that we've gone a lot closer. I've gone a lot closer to you guys. Even those who are new to youth group, just arriving from middle school, people I didn't even think I would ever talk to. I really do feel like, we've become closer together, and I really do think that has been good for my life. Especially this past year, we unfortunately, due to everything that's happened this year, we didn't get to have a spring kind of retreat or a spring lockdown together. But I really just want to thank Pastor Jim for everything he's done for us this past couple of years when he came. Going back to this year, I really do feel like I've gotten to a lot closer with a lot of the youth group, especially at that last year's winter retreat. That retreat especially will hold a special place in my heart because, there's a lot of things I learned about myself and a lot about other people who opened up to me, and how much I've been in their lives. And it made me realize how much they have been in my life as well, and how much I think of them as not only as friends, but also as brothers and sisters in Christ. So I just want to thank them again for that. And I just kind of want to address the other seniors graduating. Even though we might not see each other for a long time, I just want to say that you guys do hold a special place in my heart as well, as close friends and as sisters and brothers in Christ. Though I guess sisters in this case, because the other two are only females. So I just kind of want to leave the youth with this kind of, you guys have really meant a lot to me in my life. And I just want to leave you with, even though that many people will leave and go on to other things in life, life is still the same, in that just because people are gone doesn't mean that, the things you learn from them still kind of goes with you, and that what really matters in life is always still there, and that being God. And I just hope that as you live everyday life, you can see God through the small beauty in the everyday life actions you do. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alex. We're going to be ending our stream for today. Alex, thank you for volunteering to be our guest and co-host for today. We're going to really miss you once you're completely graduated and in college, not being able to see you probably on a week-to-week basis. But I'm sure that we'll be able to see each other from time to time because you're going to be fairly close in terms of proximity. So yeah, in any case, thank you for being here and helping me do this. Thank you all the viewers for coming and participating with us, being able to tune in for our Youth2Talk today. Just an announcement before we end. Because of the schedule that I've been having for our summer ministry so far, we are going to move. We're going to change our podcast schedule so that instead of on a weekly basis, we're going to be changing it to a bi-weekly basis. So instead of every week, we'll be doing a podcast every 2 weeks, just so that I have enough time to prepare for a podcast. And that I am able to arrange the guests and co-hosts to be able to participate in the podcast. So I'm going to be changing the schedule so that we're going to be doing a podcast every second week and every fourth week of the month. So today will be the second week of this month. I'm going to be counting weeks based on Sundays. So today's the second week. Next week, I'm just going to do 2 weeks from now. It will actually be July the 1st. I'm actually not... No, actually... Oh, today is the third week. Never mind. I will figure out a schedule, and I will announce that to you guys. In any case, thank you everybody for coming and for joining us in our Youth2Talk today. Everybody have a nice day, and we'll see you guys whenever we do this Youth2Talk next. Thank you, and goodbye.
Bye.